This was homes. These were people's homes. But they got swept up in the conflict. Let's pause here. If you zoom out and look at where we're at right now, you can see that I'm moving through these dashed lines. I've been moving in and out of these dashed lines all week. This is a border crossing. But every time I call these things borders, I get corrected.
We do not use the term border.
These are two ceasefire lines. These are not borders. Yeah, so Cyprus remains one country. There's one member state within the United Nations.
Yes, the lines and what you call them are very sensitive here. But it's hard to deny that they still feel like borders. They exist like borders, in that their goal is to divide people. This right here, for example, is a crossing through one of these dashed lines to get into the north of this island, into a self-declared country, a country that no one recognizes besides Turkey. And it's supposedly not a real... It's a border crossing. This crossing over here that's not a border crossing sure felt like a border crossing. There are gates and passport booths and customs and PCR tests. So, did I just enter into a new country? No, but kind of. I'll let you decide.
There is no Greek Cypriot politician who supports a two-state solution.
These lines are ambiguous, they're emotional, they're political, and you can learn a lot about them simply by crossing them. And now I am driving on the left side of the road for the first time in my entire life, and I can't tell you that I feel calm about it. Which is why I came to this island, Cyprus, to cross as many of these lines as I could, to understand them. These lines that envelop towns, that cut up farmland, bleed into the ocean, and infamously cut this capital city in half, making it the last divided capital on Earth.
Nicosia, the city, has many faces and many tongues: English, Armenian, French, Arabic, Christian and Muslim.
As a result, the Turks hold more than 2/3 of the island's wealth.
Nearby Ledra Street has been known as Murder Mart. Greeks and Turks live uneasily side by side.
Nicosia, the capital city of Cyprus, the center of the bitter struggle between Greek and Turk, is engulfed in war.
Let's make one thing clear. Despite what you might be thinking after you watched episode 1, Cyprus is not a war zone. It's not all military barriers and troops. Quite the opposite. This place is actually a tourist's paradise. Not too far from all the barriers, 2 million tourists a year, most of them British, can be found sunbathing in these beautiful Mediterranean waters. The largest city and capital, called Nicosia, feels like many other cities full of shops and stores, people going about their lives. But if you walk around here long enough, you'll start to notice that a lot of these streets stop at an abrupt dead end. These dead ends are made up of military barriers, sandbags, barbed wire, military outposts, soldiers with guns, and flags, lots of flags. These dead ends are the dashed lines you see when you look at Google Maps, the ones that cut through this city. But in real life, these lines are not dashed, they're not porous. These are actually very thick lines that successfully divide this city into the Greek side to the south and the Turkish side to the north. And in the middle, there's space, sometimes thick, sometimes thin, a space that is given this sterile name, the buffer zone. And remember, these are ceasefire lines, not borders, at least not according to any Greek Cypriot or UN official that you talk to. But call them what you want on paper, I want to see what these dashed lines actually feel like when you cross them. In reality, this space, this buffer zone, is a scar. A messy series of curves that in the 60s and 70s acted as a sort of shock absorber in a war that ripped this city and island apart. It was the United Nations that helped hastily draw these lines to stop the fighting between the Greek and Turkish sides, to keep these two groups who had lived side by side for centuries away from each other.
Here in the center of Nicosia, the narrowest part of the buffer zone is only 3 meters from one side to the other side. 2 soldiers on balconies on either side of the street could touch each other.
I spent time in both the Turkish and Greek sides of Nicosia, but I really wanted to get a peek over these walls, into that ambiguous space that used to be the central downtown, but now lay locked between these dashed lines.
So I'm on a roof now that is in the middle of Nicosia, the capital, and I am walking closer and closer to this buffer zone, this scar that rips through the center of the city. The Republic of Cyprus effectively ends right here, and right there, that street is no man's land. I mean, that's the north right there. Like, I'm looking across the border into northern Cyprus. This was just a normal part of the city, but because of the fighting, the line pushed back and forth and eventually settled here. But it wasn't always like this. I'm now down on the street, walking in this no man's land. So it just really gets thin. I mean, it's like, we've been in places where it's really wide, but right here it's 30 meters. Greek side, Turkish side, right there. You can look at both. And just looking at these businesses and these homes, you can envision them alive and thriving. And this street seems like a very busy main street with all of these businesses and places and these signs that are just left.
One Greek Cypriot's house was right here. Her name was Annie, and she refused to leave. She lived here for decades, with the UN soldiers often bringing her groceries. Her front door walked right out into the buffer zone, right in the crosshairs of Turkish military. It would have been within their right to fire if she walked out into this buffer zone. And yet, she remained. And then in the 90s, she died of old age here in her home. She was 91. The soldiers removed her body, they gave her a funeral, and according to the reports at the time, her body was the last thing to leave her home. Everything else stayed frozen in time, much like the rest of this buffer zone.
We're in a wool shop, an old wool shop, and the owner's records are just here, like just spread out on this table. Goods of Italian origin. This guy had quite the business. There was commerce, there was an economy, there was trade, this place was thriving. And then it just collapsed.
You're absolutely right. The buffer zone is a unique environment. The reality is that since 1974, the buffer zone has been a de facto area of very little human activity. Yeah, and what has happened as a result is the ecology of the buffer zone is unique to this island. You will find species of plant and fauna here in the buffer zone that you will not find anywhere else.
This divided capital and the time capsule buffer zone that cuts it in half is one face of this divided island. But as you drive, you soon see other versions of it. As I moved into the eastern part of this island, it turned from divided city into these British bases, and then more and more you start to see rural parts of this island. And yet the dashed line continues, even all the way out here.
It spans 180 kilometers from east to west. Further to the east of the island are the flat farmlands of the buffer zone, where we see a lot of farming activity.
So one thing you see in the buffer zone is a bunch of farmland, like people's homes and land that they had to leave in 1974. Unsurprisingly, this was a giant loss for a lot of families, and so the UN actually allows them to come back in to their old land and cultivate it. So in addition to all of these farms, there's also minefields. This was where people lived and was just a part of Cyprus. but for the past several decades, this has just been no man's land.
In many ways, farm life within the buffer zone is similar to farm life anywhere else.
I started growing tomatoes, and I fixed this land all. I put tomatoes. I planted tomatoes, but I have there peppers, aubergines. I have to fix the land to clean it.
Yeah.
But every day there are harsh reminders of what has become of this farmer's land, of his home. His work here is so distinctly juxtaposed to what you can see in the distance: Turkish military outposts, barbed wire fences, UN escorts, growing political tensions. And yet, every day that passes, this becomes a more permanent fixture of life on this island.
It's the war, a terrible thing. I remember everything because I've been in a school for 1 year in Famagusta. I was 12. We started the gymnasium there, and after is the war.
Even despite all of this, Greek Cypriots insist that their country is not divided.
When we use the term border, that means even us ourselves, we have already divided our country. And Cyprus is not divided, is occupied. 35% of the island of Cyprus is occupied.
And while that's true according to the map and to the international community, the fact remains that this division is very real. So real that it's embedded itself into the minds of people young and old who live here.
And I remember when I was in primary school, when I was first grade, and I've always seen the Cypriot flag as divided, so I was always seeing the red line, and we had to color the flag, and I've actually drew it.
Yeah.
And the teacher was like, Georgia, we're not divided.
But as a kid, you just thought that that's how it was.
So I think it's the experiences that we get from very young, and it's very difficult to get rid of these emotions.
So since 1974, effectively the two communities have been divided, and we have seen generations of young people since 1974 who have not had any contact with the other side.
And the power of these lines isn't how they affect the treaties and the peace talks and the diplomats, but instead how they stop the sides from seeing each other, from humanizing one another, leading to only more polarization.
When people were referring to the other side, we were thinking that there was no life and it was just ghosts as kids, because when people die, they also go to the other side. Yeah. When we had the first experience of crossing from the checkpoint, we did have a hesitation that what will happen when people hear us talking in Turkish, what will their reaction be?
So while the UN might not recognize these as borders, they serve the same purpose: to divide people, both physically and mentally, from one another.
I was born in a divided island, and then I can see that in the last 20 years, nothing has changed, truly changed for me. So I can say that, and even hope that we had as children, I think that now there's nothing to keep our faith up. So it just seems that even if change comes, it's not something imminent, it's not something that will come soon.
And yet, even though the younger generation grew up with these barriers in their country and in their minds, that has also allowed them to see these lines more clearly, to question them in a way that the older generation never could.
Do you think that the younger generation has more of an appetite for unity than maybe the older generations who experience some of the violence?
History teaches us that Turkish Cypriots and Greek Cypriots lived together side by side, for many, many years before the conflict. They share the same history, they share the same culture, they eat many of the same foods. And that gives us hope that peace is possible, and the young generation perhaps are at the fore of leading that effort.
Thank you, BetterHelp, for sponsoring today's video. BetterHelp is a platform that makes therapy more accessible and more secure for everybody, regardless of where you live. I've been in therapy for a couple of years now, and I can't tell you how much it has changed my world. BetterHelp will assess your needs and match you with a licensed professional therapist. You can start communicating with that therapist within 48 hours, which, if you've ever looked for a therapist, is a very quick turnaround. It's not a crisis line, it's not a self-help thing, it's professional therapy that is done securely on the internet. Finding the right fit in a therapist is really important, and BetterHelp has over 20,000 therapists in their network, which is way more than you would have in your local area. They want you to have a positive experience, and so they make it easy and free to change your therapist if needed. It's more affordable than traditional offline therapy, and financial aid is available. So go to betterhelp.com/JohnnyHarris if this is interesting to you. You'll get 10% off your first month of BetterHelp so you can try it out at a discounted price and see if it's a good fit. Thank you, BetterHelp, for sponsoring today's video.